you've met anyone other than me. So, but again, I'm David Durfee, Chair of the committee. I'm from Shaftesbury, and I represent Sunderland and Glastonbury as well. And this is Vice Chair Supernaut.
Hey, I represent Windsor 4, which is Towns of Farmers, Concord, Bridgewater, and Starford.
I'm Leland Morgan. I represent Grand Isle County and the western portion of the town of Milton.
Jed Lipsky, Lamoille 1 District South.
Richard Nelson, Orleans 1, Derby.
I know you've interacted with Sidonia, our committee assistant. If you haven't met her, Sidonia.
And Brett O'Brien.
Oh, yes, newcomer.
John O'Brien, Windsor Orange 1, Royalton and Hundred.
Right, great. Well, it's my pleasure to meet all of you. And yeah, are you ready for me to get started, or do you want me to wait for a few?
No, I think we should probably go ahead and jump in. And I think you had a chance to preview or maybe watch some of the presentation we had this morning. And Jill Remnick was here, and she did say that she expected to be some overlap with the presentations, which is perfectly fine. For many of us, it's a introduction from knowing very little, and having that reinforcement would be a good thing, I think. But I think we'll also cover some new ground.
Yes, hopefully. And just for the record, I am Ezra Holben. I am a fiscal analyst over across the street at the Joint Fiscal Office. And so today, as Chair Durfee said, we'll be doing an overview of Vermont's current use program, and I will hit some high-level areas and also bring a little bit of focus for the education fund portion, because that is my focus, education fund. So, all right. So the outline of my talk today is broadly divided into a general high-level overview of current use and then the fiscal overview of current use. And so we'll just start with the general. So current use incentivizes the preservation of Vermont's agricultural and forest resources by providing property tax savings for the property owners. And now, if you are a consumer a property owner, you would say, oh, these are tax savings. But from an education fund perspective, this is an expense, because this is reducing the property tax revenues, which fund the education fund. So I view current use as an expense rather than the savings that a property owner would view it as. Current use also has the hold harmless payments, which, as kind of the name implies, it holds the municipalities harmless for that reduced property value. And that actually comes from the general fund. So the hold harmless does not directly impact education fund through the general fund. And then the land use change tax, or LUT, those revenues go into municipalities as well as education and general funds. And so officially, this is the use value appraisal program. We all know it as current use, and just high level, established in 1978 and administered by Department of Taxes Division of Property Valuation and Review. There's also some assistance from the municipalities, the assessors there, and I believe Parks Forest is also helps with that as well. And so the statutory purpose per 32 VSA is in chapter 124 is to preserve the working landscape, preserve the rural character of Vermont, and protect the natural ecological systems and natural resources of forest land of Vermont. And the full statement purpose is up there as well. I can read through them if you would like, or if you all have maybe heard this before, don't need to.
I think that some of it was on a slide that we saw this morning in bullet forms, rather than this citations weren't there.
Okay.
And I'm just I was looking for and just wanted to make sure it was in statute, was the achieve more equitable taxation for undeveloped land. So there's the conservation aspect, but then there's also the nod towards it should be, we want a fair tax system, and this might get us closer to a fair tax system.
Yes, and also you'll see that enrollment has grown pretty substantially. It's grown from about 120,000 acres in 1980 to 2.57 million acres through 2020 or in 2024. So it's definitely grown since inception.
That was 1980. That's what
Yes.
I started.
Yes, sir, 1980. And so I have plotted that out on the graph here, just so you can see how it's grown, as well as the three categories there. So you can see that the agricultural area, that blue line on the bottom, that amount has actually, you see, remained fairly stagnant, while the forest lands have really both the total, the forest lands, which is both the managed and the exact term is escaping me. It's
Reserve.
yes, thank you. Reserve and managed. Reserve being the attaining old forest values one. And so if you're curious about that dip there, well, where you see from about 1987 through 1995 or so, you see total enrollment dip down a bit. And I believe that is the period when this program was actually underfunded. And so what happened is when there was a lack of funding, there was only a partial current use really given to enrolled owners, and then they had to make up the difference. And so and also because it was underfunded, they removed the land use change tax. So these individuals could remove since they weren't getting the full of the program. And then around that 1996, 97, it was reformed and fully funded again. And if you've seen, the enrollment has just gone up since then.
Representative Nelson.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Durfee. Isn't that 95, 97, somewhere in there when they allowed agriculture buildings to also be put into current use? There was, before it was just land and they allowed buildings to be involved.
That is a good question.
It is, it's right in that timeframe.
I just know that timeframe is also when we reformed the education system in Vermont with Brigham. So there was a lot of pieces going on with some property related to property tax at that time.
Yes, see, Representative O'Brien.
We were wondering this morning, when this was enacted, was in sort of history of tax policy, what was the thought? Like, it's going to be this huge hit on the general fund all of a sudden. So was there a thought that we'll shift some of this more to income tax or rooms and meals or whatever and away from property tax? Or I just wonder, like these days, this would be a very hard sell, I think, given our budget pressures now.
Sure, and I can't speak to the intent of when this went into effect. I will say that later in the presentation, I do have some dollar figures, and I would say that it is if you look at the dollars diverted from the education fund versus the size of the education fund today, it's a relatively small amount. So, but I'm not sure as to the legislative intent on this.
So, this is Michael Gray with Vice Council. You have to remember that property wasn't always assessed at its highest fair market value, its best use, right? And so when that shifted, which was, I think, late 60s, early 70s in Vermont, you created development pressure on those who had their land and still in the use value, wasn't using it for its highest, best fair market value use. And that put development pressure on that land. And one of the purposes of this is to prevent or to remove that pressure for conversion of land from its non-developed state to developed state. So there's history going back, and all of the states have basis because they all move to fair market value because it generates more money.
As there are questions, thanks for chiming in there, Mike. When the presentation's done, I was going to ask Mike earlier, if we're done before the hour is over, Mike might be able to come up and answer any questions that Ezra doesn't have or that we haven't covered. I guess I'm also thinking of things that we didn't think to ask that Mike might say, this would be good for the committee to know.
Yes, absolutely. Mr. O'Grady, I think he's a very deep knowledge resource for this, so I would definitely will defer to him on those questions. All right, so as you probably know, current use has been broken out into, you broadly have agriculture, and you also have the forest, which is the both reserved and managed. So agricultural land and current use includes the land and also the farm buildings as well. And so have up there that, you know, any land exclusive of the house site in active use to grow hay, cultivated crops, pasture livestock, cultivate trees bearing edible fruit, or produce an annual maple product, and that is 25 acres or more in size. Agricultural land, defined also as either owned by a farmer or land used by a farmer as part of a written lease, or land that's used to generate 2,000 in income for parcels less than 25 acres and 75 for each, or $75 per acre over those 25 acres. And I believe the threshold for that would be 5,000. And so, you know, you do have to meet that definition. So, you know, if you just have a plot in your backyard with 2 tomato plants, you probably can't go and say, you know, this agricultural land, I'm a farmer. You do have a little bit of a threshold there to meet that.
Is that $2,000 been updated at all over time?
That is, I'm not sure. That is a good question. It is in statute as the 2,000 right now.
Is that in the wraps, I think, for,
It's familiar.
yeah.
It's probably a good thing that it's not inflation adjusted because farmers have, their prices have gone up a lot.
Good, okay.
Yeah, and speaking of farmer, you know, that is defined for the purpose here of current use. And so it's an individual who earns at least 1/2 of their annual gross income from the business of farming or produces farm crops that are processed in a farm facility situated on land enrolled by them in the use value appraisal program, current use, or on a house site adjoining the enrolled land. And so, you know, again, it is a definition. Can't just say you are a farmer, you should have to meet this. And then the farm building itself is defined as all farm buildings and other farm improvements that are actively used by a farmer as part of a farming operation, are owned by a farmer or leased to a farmer under a written lease for a term of 3 years or more, and situated on land that is enrolled in use value appraisal program, current use, or on a house site adjoining enrolled land. Shall include up to 100,000 of the value of a farm facility, also processing farm crops, minimum 75% of which are produced on the farm. So,
Can you just pause there so we can absorb that last bullet point?
yes,
So a building that's valued over $100,000 is not fully exempt? Is that what this says?
of the farm facility, not necessarily a building in general, but of a farm facility process, the farm crops. So I believe that from what I understand, a farmer's house could be fully exempt, but if there's a house and then a farm facility, that could be where that 100,000 comes in. That's how I understand it.
Representative Burke.
I have a constituent that asked a question that had to do with the slide before, actually, of he's a farmer in our town and isn't making enough money at farming, so has started to work off the farm and is worried about losing his current use status. Because he might make more money off the farm and on the farm, yet it's a big part of his life. One question he had was specifically was he was leasing some hay fields. And he was speaking to this as well. Is it what's the algorithm in terms of if you make more than 50% of your income off, outside of farming, then the land that you're using can no longer be in your current use. That you own, that he also leases land. How does that affect leased land? Maybe that's a question for another time, but he's definitely very concerned about the issue. And it's something I'd like to figure out myself and be able to help there. But
Yeah, definitely. That might still fall under the agricultural definition of land, where it's, another slide back where it's the 2,000 in income for parcels less than 25 acres. And then,
yes,
so, Mr. O'Grady might, but be able to clarify, but I believe if it still qualifies as agricultural land, even if his income is not full.
But there's three different ways. So you are a farmer and you meet the definition. But your example is that farmer might still have, the hayfield might be 25 acres.
Yeah.
Right? And so he's gonna probably make $2,000 or more on using that. And so he can just enroll that parcel under the 25 acre. And then for his other parcels, he's probably gonna have to look at which one of the three eligible ways he's gonna have to qualify. It might mean he has to file 3 different applications for the different parcels depending on how he's gonna qualify that. But it's still available.
so any one of the 3 ways, as long as he qualifies for one of them, then he qualifies.
Right.
You don't have to qualify for all 3.
Well, no, you have to qualify for your parcel that you're putting in on. Say, he's leasing from a farmer, somebody that's, then if he qualifies there, because the farmer is the one that's qualified. So that's one way to do it. So the 25 acres, $2,075 an acre over 25 acres.
Yeah.
And then if he's getting half of his income or more, then it hits the entire farm.
Appreciate it.
Caroline, I'm hesitant to encourage people who aren't in the witness chair, and Mike, I know isn't technically there, but from testifying.
I think that's not technically correct.
Why don't we hold off, then you guys can consult offline, and if we need to get it correct on the record, we definitely will. So thank you for that. Representative O'Brien.
Just Mike, is that 50% rule, it's a federal, like an IRS rule
It goes back to the definition of farm.
at the federal level?
Okay, anybody else have a hand up?
We might need a whiteboard sometime, but because all these, what is a farmer
Yeah.
from a tax point of view keeps changing from federal to state to current use.
So outside of the agricultural realm, you can also qualify as forest land, either managed or reserved, and with reserve being relatively new, added by Act 146. And so they have similar definitions, but I think of the key difference being here where managed forest land is under active long-term forest management for the purpose of growing and harvesting repeated forest crops. Whereas reserve forest land does not have that. For reserve forest land, it is land that's managed for the purpose of attaining old forest values and functions in accordance with minimum acceptable standards for forest management. So that's the key difference between those two. Your managed forest land could be you're growing the trees for the intent of maybe selling them down, cutting them down, eventually selling the lumber. Reserve forest land, it's to grow the forest. That is your purpose. You want to grow a old forest, which is a specific type of forest and comply with a management plan, and you don't necessarily intend to chop down all those trees and sell them. So that is what I view as the key difference between these two types of forest land. And so So enrolled in current use, so property enrollment is optional and requires placing a lien on your enrolled property. The use value per acre is set by the current use advisory board, and that's done every year, so those values are not set in statute and then needing to be revised. And so for tax year 2024, forest land, either type, either the reserve or managed, is 188 per acre for their use value. If it's greater than 1 mile away from a class 1 to 3 road, the value goes down to 141. And agricultural land is valued at 483. And you'll notice the farm buildings are actually 0%. So there's just no value. So you don't pay taxes on your farm buildings if they're at 0%.
Thank you, Chairman. What is the advantage to enroll in forest land that is on the side of a mountain at a 6, 7, 8, 10, 12% grade that has absolutely zero developmental value with today's Act 250 standards? Why would people need to enroll that land when that land is absolutely worth what it's doing, which would be $188 an acre or $141 an acre? Why would people have to enroll that land then? And is that preserved forest? Is that to grow foliage?
So reserve forest is, so it's defined as managed for the purpose of attaining old forest values. And so that is a specific type. You can't just, I don't think you can just grow any sort of tree. You do have to have a management plan for that property. I would say that the reason for enrollment is because the use value per acre would be less than the fair market, the assessed value of that land. So if an appraiser for the municipality assesses that land as being worth higher than this, then financially it would make more sense. But if that land was assessed, I suppose, below this, then I could see why it may not be advantageous for someone to enroll. But those are values that are set for the entire state and not parcel by parcel. And so it's that versus the fair market value that assessed by a municipality's assessor.
I think I like that answer. I'm also though going to ask Mike if he could speak to it, speak to the conversations that the legislature had in 2022. If there's anything that you would add to that.
So the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation has a goal of managing all forest land, all forest cover in the state to reach a goal of old forest. So because of the benefits that provides, they haven't been reaching that goal. And one of the ways that the House Energy and our Environment and whatever they were last way before, one of the ways we wanted to look at that is to use current use as a way to do that, because in current use, managed forest land needs a management plan. It has to have some harvesting as part of the plan. But in old growth forest, there's an incentive not to forest in big parts of it. And so they had to create a new category, and it includes those steep slopes. It includes those sandy soils where it might not be conducive to foresting. And one of the criteria that the department has offered, so that people don't look at it as a way to just warehouse manageable land, is to say that if you have, I'm probably not going to get this right, but if it's 100 acre, under 100 acres of land that's going to be enrolled as reserve, 50% of it needs to be ecologically sensitive treatment areas. So it's land that has a function other than the management of the forest for its resources. And if it's over 100 acres, it's 30%. And so it's providing value, but not in the traditional products form. And that's why it was created that way, and it focuses on those parts of the forest where management might have been difficult or even impossible if it was like, say, a vernal wetland.
Thank you.
Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, to follow up on Councilor Grady's interpretation, I believe he's correct. But these are very more recent esoteric values that have emerged in a time where biodiversity has emerged as a value, and the science of carbon has entered into the forest management goals or values. And it's not accurate to say to grow old growth forests. It's really old growth characteristics, very unique microcosmic values that are complex. And it may take another 150 years to actually achieve old growth status, which really begins at over 230 years. So but it's new science and new awareness. To Councilor's interpretation, these weren't critical values since met forever. And by the way, if we're talking about truth and facts, most all Vermont forests are aging every year, because 3 times more for every year, 3 times of more forest is growing older and larger than is being actively managed or harvested.
When we have the department in FPR, I know they'll want to talk about this more, and I think we'll be presenting specifically on what's happened since 2022 when that category was first formed. So we'll have a chance to talk to them about it too. Representative Rebecca.
So just quickly though, whether it's managed or reserved, that assessment of acreage value is the same, right, for either one?
Yes, sir. For forest land, it's valued at the same. It just expands your options for enrolling, as was the representative pointed out. All right, so I'm trying to find, there we go. So now we'll just go through the equation for calculating the tax savings, or like I said, or a revenue loss, depending on how you're looking at it. So current use is calculated with your enrolled acreage times the use value per acre, which we just looked at on the previous slide, times the town CLA, the town it's located in, and that is the total use value of your enrolled property. So the property owner of that enrolled land pays property taxes based on the use value, not what it would be assessed at as a fair market value. And so the difference between the two is the land use reduction. And so what happens is you have what would be the fair market value, you remove the land use reduction, and then that remainder is what your taxes as a property owner would be based on. And so therefore it reduces your municipal and non-homestead property taxes. And so we'll take a look at how that would look here, a little bit of math. So, if you have your 50 forest land acres at, like we looked at, the 188, whether this is managed or reserved. And so you get your use value of 9,400. And then when you multiply it by this particular town's CLA, it would be that 8,655 and 52 cents. And this individual has all 3 different values here. So if you put all those together and round it up, you would get the total land use value of 22,000. And so the difference between the enrolled value and the use value is that land use reduction of 197,000. But this landowner will only pay on the use value, the 22,000. Okay, so
So the, just to make sure the term enrolled value,
Yes.
that's what, that's the, if this were just normal land, or if there were no UVA.
So yeah, the enrolled value is where you're starting. So this is what the land would be worth, the fair market that it was assessed at. That's your enrolled value. And then you go through this calculation of, well, if it's forest land, if it's agricultural land, or if it's away from your roads, that's when you then find out the use value. And so you're using the use value to reduce your taxes by paying on use value rather than enrolled value, because it's not. Yes, does that answer your question, sir? Okay. So to take this another step further, now that we see where we got the use value from, we can now take a look at a hypothetical tax bill with and without enrollment in current use. So using the same individual's assessed property value of the 219,000. So if they had enrolled in current use with those hypothetical splits we just looked at, they would have that land use reduction of 197 coming out, leaving them with a total taxable value of 22,000. So then you calculate the grand list value by multiplying it by the 0.01 to get your grand list value for tax calculation. That's what you multiply the tax rates against. So this individual pays their municipal tax rate and their non-homestead tax rate, and that leaves them with a total property tax of $528.57. If the same individual, for whatever reason, did not enroll in current use, they would have to pay on the full 219,000, which after the grand list would be 2190. And so the municipal taxes would be 1339.40, non-homestead, using the December 1 letters rate of $1.791 per hundred on non-homestead. And so their total property tax would be $5,261. So you can see there that this individual is saving about $4,700 by taking advantage of current use versus if they, for whatever reason, did not, or if the program did not exist. So as a property as a property owner, this is a tax savings, but as education or whatever, the government, that is a revenue loss. So again, there's two ways to look at it. And so, but as you can see, that's pretty substantial savings for this individual.
90%.
Yeah, exactly. And depending on the type of land you have enrolled, the savings could be much higher, much lower, because each type has that different use value. So yeah, and so that leads us right into the fiscal overview. How does this individual's tax savings play into the fund as a whole? So it's a program cost from My World of Education Fund. And so you can see here that you have the foregone municipal taxes labeled general fund, because the hold harmless payment has to come from the general fund. So the $20.5 million that the statewide municipalities, and these are, I should have started this, these are taxes numbers, PVR numbers. And so that 20.5 needs to be paid back through the grant, or excuse me, the general fund. And so, like I said, tax savings for one could be, tax loss, revenue loss for another. Education fund, it's higher, it's 55.6. And so the total foregone revenue for 2024 was $76.19 million, split between the ed and general fund. And so just to look at the education fund, so based on this data in 2024, the foregone revenue was equal to about 7% of the non-homestead property taxes collected in fiscal year 2024, which was a total of $792.3 million. And so, I've had this question was posed to me when I presented to House Ways and Means, what would the tax rate have looked like? Well, that would have been a policy decision, so, it's hard to say exactly, but if this 55.7 million was still in the education fund, depending on the choices made by you as the legislators, the tax rate could have perhaps been different. You could have said, okay, we want to use that to either expand a program or to reduce the homestead or non-homestead property tax. So, that's just one way to look at it. But again, if you're a property owner, you view that as money that you saved. So again, it depends on how you want to look at it. For the hold harmless payment, which,
Question, Representative O'Brien.
Just quickly on
yes, sir.
that example you showed of the $4,000 savings, the property owner.
Sure.
So to follow up with just that one example, then the state is paying the town that much in essentially foregone property tax revenue, or does it act as a credit eventually towards that? Because it's coming back in the ed fund.
So that's a good question. I think what you're asking is kind of a two-parter. So the municipal tax rate, that's the money that the town itself would be collecting. So that's not through the ed fund. So that would need to be given back to the town because that was a municipal tax. But the non-homestead tax rate, yeah. So since it's a statewide education system, that's why the hold harmless payment is just for the municipal tax rate, because the rest of the state is collectively funding that education fund. So the state doesn't need to per se keep track of like, okay, we're going to send this town this for the non-homestead portion. But for the municipal tax rate, since that is not a statewide, that's why the general fund has the hold harmless, and education fund is not part of the hold harmless, if that answers your question. All right, but and yes, for this individual, it would be the difference between the 134.55 and that 1339. The municipal tax is the amount that would be sent from the general fund to this particular municipality, and the difference between the homestead rates, that is just made up in the ed fund, like as a whole. Yeah, so great question. And so municipalities hold harmless payment. They're compensated 100% for the non-homestead municipal property tax reduction, as we just kind of touched on. And so the 2025 number, I believe tax issues this in November of the year. So on November 1st of 2024, they assess the hold harmless payment for fiscal year 2025 as 19.77 million. And so land use change tax is kind of the third part of this. You have your municipal, your non-homestead from the ed fund, and then you have the land use change tax feeding into the equation as well. So once your land is enrolled for current use, there's a lien placed on it. And so if you wish to develop that land or withdraw, you have a LUT that is assessed on you. And so develop has a very long list of definitions on the statute, but just to call out some of the high level ones, construction of any building, road, or other structure, or any mining, excavation, or landfill activity. And I believe this was touched upon by your earlier presenter, but the LUT is assessed at the time that it's withdrawn. So if you withdraw your land but don't necessarily develop it, that LUT is not necessarily going to be due immediately, but the amount is frozen at that time of when you withdrew your land. And so that is assessed at 10% of what the fair market value was assessed at of the property. And of that 10%, half of it, when it's collected, will go to the municipality up to 2,000 per instance. And then the remainder is split 75-25% between the education and general fund. So that is a little bit that flows back into those funds. And so I think these numbers will look pretty familiar for the committee. But just to reiterate, from what was mentioned earlier by tax, in 2024, the lot that was assessed on developed acres was 1.7 million. And then the amount that was passed on to the municipalities was a little over 500,000. So. And just to close out with some policy considerations, tourism in Vermont, you could consider that motivated by the natural scenic resources, rural landscape of Vermont. And according to, Forest Parks Recreation estimates, that's almost 5%, 2.1 billion of the state's GDP is related to outdoor recreation. So that's just something to consider, in addition to all the other things to consider. That's just one from a financial perspective that I thought was interesting to call out. And that's all I have prepared for you all. And some of my resources, additional resources, are on the last slide there as well.
And let's look at those. So current use in your property tax bill. So that's the tax department's webpage. The annual report, I think Jill came this morning with a hard copy of it.
Yeah, it's a great report, very, very in-depth. And then also, there are Excel files that go along with each written report. And so if you employ Excel data, that's very interesting to look at as well. So.
Since we're having this conversation in the context of, partly anyway, in the context of the education fund and reforming or, overhauling that, I think it's going to be helpful to know what that $55 million figure or whatever, the latest number is, that's what you described as a tax expenditure. What that translates into in terms of the tax rate. And I remember from several years ago now, so it may be outdated, the rule of thumb was that $10 million in the education fund translated into a penny on the tax rate. Very simple, easy to remember, but I suspect that's somewhat out of date.
So yes. It is a good rule that, it's a rule of thumb that, but yes, it is also outdated. The reason why it's hard for me to just, and I'm looking to see here, get the exact number of the size of the education fund, but the problem with saying, yes, this would explicitly lower is because you have homestead and then non-homestead. So the legislature would have to decide, where are you putting? Are you uniformly lowering those rates? Do you want to put all that towards one subset of property versus the other? So that's why, like I said, it's kind of hard to just say yes, it would, because the yield bill is set with uniform rates because that's what in statute we are required to do. But after that, everything else would be left up to the legislative body as to where that would go. And, through the GovRec DAA, the total uses is valued at 2.3 billion. So, the scope is that out of 2.3 billion, 55 is a relatively small.
So I want to try and quantify that relatively small amount, and recognizing that not expecting you to sit there and do it on your laptop. But and maybe a way to think about it so that it's a little less charged is that if we were to fund it through let's say through the general fund. So let's say it were the general fund rather than ed fund expense. And I think for simplicity's sake, assuming that you would spread that savings across the different categories, the homestead, non-homestead, and do that equally.
Yeah, so I can
You can come back.
Yes, I can certainly come back and give you an answer on that, feed it through the model. Let me just jot that down here. But yes, no, it is a great question, and keeping it uniform, I can work with that.
That's been the approach, I think, that the legislature's taken in recent years anyway. So assume that would be the case.
Yes, sir.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Chairman. Has anyone looked at what the land suck would be if the current use was dissolved and farmers had to start paying taxes on $20,000 an acre land? And if it had a view, maybe $40,000 an acre land, what kind of degradation would we see to agriculture in the state of Vermont and the lack of ability to acquire land?
If it has been done, I am not aware of it. But that's something.
It would be insurmountable. The number of dairy farms in the state would probably drop by half in 2 or 3 years. I surmise.
So when we have Friday, I think the ag agency is coming in to continue this conversation, and they will, I'm sure, be prepared to address that question. More up their alley than JFO's.
Yeah.
So good, thank you.
Question.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing up what rural lands, undeveloped lands do for our tourism industry. Because people do come here to see fields and trees and foliage and cows and tractors.
Yeah, absolutely. As a nationwide, I believe the percentage that Vermont's GDP is from outdoor recreation is certainly above average. So,
Second only to Hawaii.
yeah, so I think the nation agrees with that assessment for sure.
We had FPR come and talk about that a few weeks ago.
Yes.
All right, any other questions, number questions for Ezra? Thank you, Ezra. Ted, did you have anything just while we're on numbers before we ask Mike to come up?
No.
Yeah, okay. Great, thank you. All right, Mike, do you mind coming up and?
Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you all.
You were here this morning and heard the presentation, and you've been listening in on this as well, and I know there are a few questions that we already asked you, but is there anything that you would, just having heard the questions in the back and forth, that you would say, oh, this is something the committee might want to know or think about or delve into further?
First, I thought both of the presentations were very good. Director Remick has wealth of knowledge that most people don't. And Ezra's presentation is great. But one of the things, well, there's two things I want to talk about a little bit, and I'll start with more of the mechanical, like the legal aspect of it. Every state has use value. Every state does it differently. You could argue that Vermont is on a more difficult to enroll end of the spectrum. I think Montana has the highest acreage threshold. It's like 150 acres in California, then Michigan, and then Vermont. In many other states, it's 5 acres or 10 acres. Many states don't have income requirements. Some states like Iowa, you just need a good faith dedication to the fact that you're farming, and there's no penalty when you take it out of farming. And so there's a whole spectrum of how states regulate and legislate current use. And you have options if you want to. You can do different rates. Some states do different rates. And they do different rates sometimes based on parcel size. And so there are things that you can do within your policy wheelhouse that you can look at other states and how other states do that. So that's kind of the mechanical aspect of it. The policy aspect of it is any change is going to have consequence. Whether or not is Representative Nelson's point is that it's going to put development pressure on farms because farms, especially dairy farms, are working right at the margin right now. Hopefully the new farm bill will get them some more money, but who knows? And in 5 years, it might be gone, and then the property value and the tax rates might lead to conversion. And then there's this is kind of my favorite one. I call it the opportunity cost argument, but it's not really an opportunity cost. It's if you convert land and you develop that land, the municipality now has more cost. The municipality has to pay for the roads. They have to pay for the schools. They have to pay for the other services that is going to be on that developed land. Where right now the farm is almost no cost to the municipality, besides what they're held harmless for, right? And maybe some municipalities will say they contribute to stormwater as well, but they also control a lot of stormwater as well. So you have that argument that if you change the current use program in any way, there's going to be consequences. And one of the consequences people argue is that it's going to be more expensive to administer education, municipal budgets, etc. So that's something, I don't know if that's quantifiable by JFO or not. I mean, it is partially speculative because it depends on the parcel and what is done with the parcel and the value of that parcel in the area where it's converted. But it is an argument that advocates for current use make. It's like, remember that this land doesn't cost you much to have in your town, because either the farmer assumes all the cost, or managed forest land doesn't have a lot of cost for a town. It's just there. So that's another policy aspect of it. I can't remember who mentioned it this morning, or maybe also this afternoon, but carbon sequestration, the department has said that yes, the forested acres, not just use value, but the forested acres in Vermont are a significant carbon sink for the state and eats like 50% of the carbon emissions in the state. And so if you're going to take away use value and you're going to put pressure on managed forest land, it's going to put a pressure on meeting things like the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so it's just, years ago when I was doing the Lake Champlain TMDL, someone asked me, what if we do nothing? And I was listening to a Sturgill Simpson song at the time where Sturgill sang, all we really need to do is sit around and wait to die. And that's true, but there's consequences to that, right? Everything has a consequence. And that is like if you're going to do this, yeah, maybe the Ed Fund or the impact to the Ed Fund is latent, but what else happens? And I don't know if you can quantify all the what else. And it's just something to keep in mind when you're doing this. You've got options. You got plenty of models from every other state. And we can explore how to do it. But there's consequences. Maybe we don't know all the consequences now. Maybe we won't learn them until 10 years.
Representative O'Brien had a hand up earlier.
Yeah, just one, you said every state has use value. Does that mean they all have this tax break for farming and forest land? Or are there other things like recreation, like Representative Lipsky was saying about horses, are there expanded use values of land that also get a tax break?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me. I have this 50 state graph. BLS guy, adjunct professor, did this. He's also a forester, I think. Did this a couple of years ago. And he says that different states allow for additional types of activities. I haven't vetted all of that, so I would have to vet that to really answer that accurately.
Mostly it was farming or forest originally.
What I was looking at was farming.
Representative Lipsky, did you have a hand up?
Yes, I do. And if it's not relevant is such relevant. When I listened to Ezra's presentation, he spoke of non-homestead category. But I never once heard homestead category. Business and second homes make up collectively the non-homestead. Some communities, like mine or like Dover, might have
More of that than homestead, right?
non-homestead of the housing stock our community. I think Dover has over 80% of its housing stock in non-homestead. So, and there's criticism from my constituents that why do the homesteaders pay more than the non-homesteaders in the overall tax burden? So that it may not be relevant to.
Well.
I don't know if it's totally relevant to current use. I think it's a larger question for you all.
Not a trivial, not an unimportant question, for sure. But maybe not directly related.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say again that so that we can continue to have this conversation without anyone feeling like somebody's trying to take something away, that a better way to think about it might be if we weren't funding current use through the education fund, but if there was a general fund transfer to cover that $55 million. So current use doesn't change at all, except the way it's paid for changes, rather than not paid for through property taxes. So if that helps, in thinking about it and understanding. I'm curious, because of our statewide education fund, whether in other states, recognizing there's probably 50 different approaches, whether the local school systems effectively end up being the ones who pay for it in other states, or whether it's somehow funded differently.
I would have to do research on that, and I can do that.
I don't know if it's you or JFO, but it'd be helpful. Representative Burke.
To the question I had earlier about 50% income for farmers, is that, you were saying other states don't have this.
Other states don't have it, and I said, I can't remember who asked the question, I think it was Representative O'Brien, whether it was federal. It's not specifically the 50% income is a state statutory provision, provided that you meet the definition of farmer under the IRS definition of farmer.
Okay.
So the 50% is in state statute, but it's a link to the IRS standard as well.
And that's a total, like if you're married, it's combining your wife's, the partner's incomes together.
People get creative about that and creating like LLCs. But if you don't have that creativity, they'll probably look at your household income.
Yeah. So it's looking at household income.
So it's a little confusing, and I am a little confused about who's not eligible to enroll their farmed land in current use. So if you have 25 acres or more that you're farming by,
You're a farmer.
You're a farmer by the federal income definition.
You have half your incomes from farming as defined by the IRS.
And you're
in. You're out.
If you make more money, you have a side business that flows into your 1040.
You can try to enroll under if it's 25 acres or less, you can try to enroll that way. But then if it's 75 acres or more, you can still try to enroll, but you have to make a certain amount of money from that acreage per acre.
Okay.
But forest land, there are no requirements, right? As far as income.
Size And you have to have a managed forest.
Right.
And it has to be managed. It actually has to be managed.
So that would cover like Weyerhaeuser owning big blocks of timberland. It's probably in current use and they manage it.
Yeah, I mean, I do know that there are timber holdings that have their land in current use because they, well, Representative Lipsky probably knows this more than I, that their plan is to manage, just manage for a while, but then ultimately to hopefully have a larger return in maybe 20 years or 30 years. So, but it still has to be managed over each 10-year period.
Anything else from Mike, or Mike, anything else that you wanted to add?
No, it's just that I think it's really important what the agencies, both of the agencies say about how important this program is to the two industries. I do think those are the experts for the people who are actually enrolled in the program, and I think their input is going to be very valuable. I mean, Keith is great, and Anson is good on this topic. Keith at Thompson at first, and Anson's good on this topic as well. So I think those are good people to talk to.
We have Ryan Patch scheduled to come in.
Yeah, he's good too.
I
Keith's,
think we asked the agency who they would like to have come in, and they said, Keith. Yeah. Good. All right. Thanks, Mike. Committee members, any other,
Thank you, Mike.
any other thoughts from the committee? So I just want to follow up on Mike's last comment. Please, we don't think of this as how do we get rid of current use?
There's nobody in this room.
Yeah.
Oh, that's true.
But what we do want to do is understand what is it doing to the ed fund, and if
But you're saying it's a $55 million hit to the ed fund?
that's what their
Yeah.
good numbers, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought it was 100 and something million hit to the ed fund. It was just 5 million to the municipal. No, 20 million to the municipal fund.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Are we gonna stretch?
I think it's about time to stretch unless anybody had anything else.
That's Chairman there, please.
Break. Sitting in this chair, our stretch is proof.
Yeah. All right, let's stretch or do